All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Ty Edwards with Johnson County Community College's Kansas Studies Institute. We are so excited to have you with us today for our conversation about Thomas Johnson, the namesake of our county and our college. I want to thank, of course, Dr. Kevin Abing for being with us today. I've read much of Kevin's work. Many people I know in the county have, and so we're so excited to have him with us today. I also want to thank JCCC's Collaboration Center. And this is a co-hosted event with the JCCC Center for Sustainability. Especially thank you to Christy Howell. Christy is going to be with those of you attending in person in the collab. So as we go through, if you have questions and you're in the collab, please tell them to Christy. And if you have questions while you are on Zoom, you can put them in the chat and we will get to those at the end of our conversation. All right, so Dr. Kevin Abing, can you please start us off with introducing some of the things we need to know to get started to talk about Thomas Johnson?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you all today. Johnson, obviously is one of the more prominent people in Kansas history. The county and the college is named for him after all, but he's also one of the more controversial figures in Kansas history. He's a hard person to pin down. He was a bundle of contradictions. As a Methodist minister, he was a man of God, but he also owned slaves. So he benefited from a system that debased one part of the human race, but at the same time, he was a missionary among the Native Americans for years, trying to uplift them. Primarily, it was the Shawnee Indians primarily, but uplift them from what he considered a savage way of life to take their place amongst civilized society. And he established the Shawnee Indian Manual Labor School in 1839 as the means to facilitate that transformation. And though, he was motivated by good intentions. He honestly probably thought he was doing something good for the Indians. The experiences for the Indian children who attended the school was for many was culturally traumatic. So even with those good intentions, they're offset by Johnson's this overwhelming ambition that he had to dominate the missionary field there, and it poisoned relations with other missionary groups, with several government officials, and with many of the Shawnee people. And Johnson, he was an aggressive entrepreneur. He embodied this 19th century American go-getter who was constantly on the lookout to make a buck. Because he certainly capitalized on every situation there was to make more profits at the school. And there's no hard evidence or smoking gun to prove that he used the school to line his own pockets, but let's just say that there were plenty of reasons for suspicion. Bottom line, he was a lot richer when the school closed than when he started. And then lastly, he's very much involved in allowing slavery into Kansas territory, which helped spark the whole Bleeding Kansas period, and which was the bloodiest pre-Civil War conflict between pro and anti-slavery factions. But once the Civil War itself started, Johnson remained a resolute supporter of the Union. And he was more than likely, he was killed for that stand. And so all of these factors, these contradictions, really make Johnson a fascinating study. So, just to kind of back up, give everybody a little background about Johnson. He was born July 11th in 1802 in Nelson County, Virginia, which is on the east side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was the son of a Revolutionary War veteran, Claiborne Johnson, and his wife, Elizabeth. And they lived very modestly, and like many Americans, they moved west to try to find a better way or a better life, basically. And they moved to Howard County, Missouri in 1822. Now, Thomas became a Methodist minister in 1826, and over the next 4 years, he labored or worked among white settlers in Missouri and in Arkansas. And he undoubtedly encountered many Native Americans, along his circuit. And Johnson, he seemed well suited for this demanding life of an itinerant minister, on the very edges of the American frontier at the time. He was a large, robust man, like 6 feet tall. He weighed in the neighborhood of 250 pounds, which at that time was a very big man. And probably because of that size, he had a very commanding presence, and he had a take charge attitude, no matter what the situation was. He was a very effective administrator, and he was often commended for having this full, pleasant voice, which really came in handy for his preaching. Johnson's life took a turn in 1830. On September 7th, he married a 20-year-old Sarah Tuttle Davis. And then little more than a week later, the Missouri Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, they formed a missionary society, and they appointed Thomas missionary to the Shawnee Indians. All with the hope that Johnson would be able to convert the Indians away from their numerous heathen deities, and hopefully they would convert to worshiping the one Christian God. Now the Shawnee Reserve in the Indian Territory, it was a 1.6 million acre tract that was along the Missouri border, a few miles south of the Kansas River, and it extended 120 miles to the west. And so that's the area where Johnson and his new bride went to work. In December 1830, they had started building a mission school in the territory near what is now Turner, Kansas. And then that school opened the following spring. And that was the work that occupied most of Johnson's time for the next 3 decades. But his time as a missionary was not without numerous controversies along the way. Johnson and the Methodists, they weren't the only religious denomination to work among the Shawnee at that time. The Baptists, they established a mission there in 1832, and then the Quakers, they followed suit in 1837. But apparently Johnson did not play well with the other denominations because he was determined that the Methodists would monopolize that work among the Shawnee. And so you've got a lot of jealousy that was evident. There's a lot of squabbling that went on, especially between the Methodists and the Baptists. And things got so bad that in October of 1834, the Shawnee Tribal Council met, and they asked the federal government to remove all missionaries from the Shawnee field. That they had had enough of all this, bickering and going back and forth. It didn't happen, of course, but it set this nasty tone that it persisted for a long time. Now Johnson, he ramped up that bad blood when he established the Shawnee Indian Manual Labor School in 1839 in what is now present-day Fairway, Kansas. And this operation or this effort, it was unprecedented in scope in terms of Indian schools. And it epitomizes Johnson's determination to dominate the mission field among the Shawnee. Because this school, it occupied 3 sections of land, nearly 2,000 acres of fertile land that straddled this well-traveled Santa Fe Trail. So it's in prime location. And the school, it included 2 large brick dormitories / schoolhouses, as well as various other farm buildings. There was a farmer's residence, shops. There was a sawmill, a grist mill, like kind of thing. And a 3rd brick dormitory was added a few years later. And the whole theory behind the school was to isolate the children that were going to be educated there, to isolate them from the bad influences of their heathen parents, and then a good dose of religious instruction, and teaching them the English language, and providing a rudimentary elementary education, and finally providing training in what was then called the manual arts. For boys, it was farming, blacksmithing, carpentry, etc. And for the girls, it was cooking, sewing, weaving, that kind of thing. The school, it received an annual pledge of $10,000 from the Methodist Episcopal Missionary Society in New York City. And then the federal government, they pledged to provide up to $5,000 toward the construction costs of the school, and also an annual $2,500 grant to educate Indian children. So you got an initial investment of $17,500, which in today's money is over $500,000. So, I mean, it got off to a good financial start. And then that's not including the money that the Methodists collected from other tribes in the area who sent their kids to the school. Initially, the number of students at the manual labor school number, a little average about 100 per year. The government, the federal government just lavished praise upon the school, saying, I mean, this is the shining example of how to go about educating Indian children and, having them become good, basically like good white farmers, basically. And naturally, all that praise and all that money going towards the Methodist mission generated a lot of jealousy among the Baptists and the Quakers, who were operating much smaller schools among the Shawnee. Now, in 1841, ill health forced Johnson to give up his duties as superintendent. And the family, they moved to Cincinnati for a year or so that Johnson, he received treatment from doctors there. But by 1845, he seemed to have recovered well enough so that he moved back to Missouri, built a farmhouse near Fayette, Missouri. But his time at the Shawnee School wasn't done. 1847, he's reassigned to the Shawnee mission. And at this point, I mean, the Shawnee mission is probably at the height of its influence, of its popularity. But from this point on, it undergoes this steady decline. And Johnson focused his attention more and more on. Now, the decline at the school, it stemmed primarily from from two interrelated trends. One was the increased agitation over slavery, and then the second was this growing demand by white settlers for Indian land. And Johnson, as one of the more prominent people in the Indian Territory, he was in the center of both controversies. First of all, he was a slave owner, as we mentioned, and he brought slaves to the Indian Territory as early as 1832, which was in contradiction of the Missouri Compromise, which forbid slavery above the 3630 degree line of latitude. But he brought them anyway. And now the presence of slaves at the school, for a few years, it didn't seem to be that big of a deal. I mean, there weren't any complaints about it or anything like that. But 1844 is a turning point because that year the Methodist Church split into northern and southern factions all over the slavery issue, and the missions among the Shawnee fell to the Methodist Church South. So obviously, they're pro-slavery. And because of that, the already bitter relation between the Methodists and the Baptists and the Quakers deteriorated even further because those other denominations, they vehemently opposed slavery. I mean, they questioned this obvious contradiction of the Methodists using slave labor to civilize Native Americans. It just didn't seem to make sense for them. Now, equally devastating was this push to open Indian lands to white settlement. Now, the problem was that in the removal treaties of the 1820s and 1830s, the federal government promised that this land in the Indian Territory would belong to the Native Americans for as long as the grass grows and the water runs, basically forever. But forever didn't last very long. The pressure to open up this area for economic development by white settlers, it peaked in the early 1850s. And naturally, all of the Native American tribes along the Missouri border, I mean, they're up in arms. They don't know what's going to happen. And they couldn't really turn to the federal government because, I mean, they're not about to stop what this seemingly unstoppable wave or tide of American progress. And Johnson played a crucial role in this whole mess as well, because he served as an advisor or an interpreter to the Shawnee Indians as they negotiated a new treaty with the federal government in 1854. And so the end result of the treaty was that the Shawnee, they ceded 1.4 million acres to the federal government. They kept 200,000 acres, which was going to be broken up into individual allotments, for each person, except there was one band, Black Bob band, who managed to maintain their chunk of that land in common. Now, Johnson, he made sure during these treaty negotiations that the Methodists, they retained control of those 3 sections of land that Johnson eventually acquired for himself. So he did very well. Now, this whole move, this drive, of course, set the stage for the creation of Kansas Territory. And again, Johnson played a crucial role in that. As a member of the first territorial legislature, he helped pass these very stringent pro-slavery laws, which set off these violent clashes, during the Bleeding Kansas period. Now, the Indians did not fare well during this period, because no matter what side of that slavery issue the settlers were on, it didn't matter, because they were all guilty of stealing from the Shawnee, forcing many of them off their land. And so they're just caught in the middle of this mess. And then while all this is going on, conditions at the Shawnee Mission are deteriorating so badly that the tribe asked the government to cancel the contract. Now the Methodists and Johnson, they managed to hang on to it for a few years yet, but things are definitely on the downslide. Now, Johnson, he turned over the day-to-day operations to his son, Alexander, in 1858. And then he moved to this large mansion in Westport, Missouri, but he continued in his role as superintendent of the mission, and he continued collecting the government funding for the mission, despite these, adamant opposition by the Shawnee Indians. The school, I guess you could say, mercifully closed its doors in 1862. And by this time, the Civil War is raging. And, border ruffians, guerrillas, bushwhackers, whatever you want to call them, from both sides, in Missouri, Kansas, they're committing all sorts of violence against the Shawnee still. And again, they're driving many of them off their land, and many fled to the relative safety of the Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. But as far as Johnson is concerned, despite his Southern sympathies, he maintained his loyalty to the Union. And as you might expect, that did not sit very well with slavery advocates. And on the night of January 2nd, 1865, a group of men stopped at Johnson's home in the middle of the night. And they asked him for directions. And from his doorway, Johnson provided the information. Then all of a sudden, some of these men they rush towards the door. And Johnson managed to shut the door, lock it before they could enter, but they started shooting. And one of those bullets penetrated the door. It struck Johnson and killed him instantly. Now, we don't really know who it was that killed Johnson. One version says that it was a botched robbery attempt, but most likely it was pro-slavery men who were retaliating against Johnson's efforts on behalf of the Union. But Johnson, he was buried the next day in the Shawnee Indian Mission Cemetery. And I guess that's appropriate. That's his final resting place. I mean, he did dedicate much of his life there. But his legacy, I mean, it's definitely mixed. I mean, especially if you look at it from the Shawnee's perspective. The operation of the school came into question numerous times. There were many complaints about students being mistreated, that the conditions there were less than hygienic. And there were several complaints about children who got sick and died at the school, yet the Methodists never informed the parents about that. So, so you got all that. And then there's a great deal of suspicion about Johnson operating the school for his own benefit. I mean, in the end, he ended up with 1,200 acres of land, and he didn't pay a cent for them. So he did very well for himself. And beyond that, he fostered a great deal of divisiveness between among the Shawnee. I mean, there were splits, the pro and anti-slavery groups between Methodist and Baptist and Quaker groups. There was a group that wanted to, basically assimilate more into American society versus a group that wanted to maintain their traditional lifestyle. So there's a lot of rifts. I mean, it was a very complicated situation there. And then Johnson helped set forces in motion that ultimately led to the Shawnee being robbed blind and forced off their land. So, I think we have to be careful about putting people up on a pedestal here. I mean, Johnson had very human foibles. And clearly, as the saying goes, there's two sides. Happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, I have a few questions, and if anyone in the audience wants to start sharing those with Christy in the collab, or if you want to put them in the chat on Zoom, I'll start with a few questions, and then we'll get to your audience questions. So thank you so much, Kevin. That's wonderful sort of prelude so that can help us ask good questions. So one of the questions we have is, how did the federal government become involved in religious conversion of Indigenous peoples? And why were there multiple Protestant Christian denominations competing to missionize the Shawnee?
Okay. Well, the federal government, it was always very early on, it was a goal of theirs to civilize the Indians. It was much more cost effective than sending in troops to try to exterminate the Indians, and it was more of a morally better stand. However, the federal government didn't really have the infrastructure to go out and have these missionaries go out and carry out this plan, and so it was left to individual religious societies to take up that task. And the federal government was more than happy to let them do that, because in theory they were had a higher moral standard, and they would provide a good example to the Indians as far as how good American citizens should act. So it was a very nice I guess coming together for the federal government relying on these religious societies. And there was what was called the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century. And, there's huge outpouring of religious fervor, and these various religious groups they became really interested in proselytizing the word, for all, not just, Native Americans, but overseas as well. And Native Americans were just part of that. So, you got missionary societies being formed by the various denominations, and the federal government, they started, helping with financially with this whole effort. In 1819, they created what was called the Civilization Fund. So they would dole out money to the different groups to help. They would use it to buy plows and that kind of thing, and establish schools, that kind of thing, to help civilize the Native Americans. And so that, it just kind of went hand in hand, and it made sense because to all Americans back then, I mean, civilized society was, number one, it was a Christian society. Number two, I mean, you had to speak English. I mean, to them, it was like the pinnacle, form of expression. And number three, basically it was, farming individual plots of land. In their view, the Indians, they were wasting all this land that they just roamed around on, and to them, that was a sin. And so, I mean, they all entered this missionary field with all sorts of gusto here, and the Shawnee Indians, they were lucky enough to have 3 denominations, or unlucky enough to have 3 denominations working there. So I guess it all depends on how you look at it.
Right. Okay. Thank you. All right. So what was the Shawnee experience with missionization, at least with Johnson, if you can speak to that? How did it impact their families and community? And you mentioned a little bit about factionalism. And do you know how they tried to resist Johnson or try to resist some of these efforts?
Sure. I mean, as I said before, that the situation among the Shawnee was very complex. I mean, the Shawnee, they were scattered more so than pretty much any other Native American tribe. I mean, there was in Ohio, by the early 20th century, they were congregated mostly in Ohio or Missouri, but there were some in Arkansas and, even into Oklahoma. So there were some divisions already before the Methodists showed up between these Ohio Shawnee and the Missouri Shawnee, because the treaty that Missouri Shawnee signed, which they gave up the Missouri land for this this tract in the Indian Territory. Part of that treaty was that the Ohio Shawnee could share the land in the Indian Territory, but it really wasn't theirs. So there's a lot of tension between that. And then you've got many of the Ohio Shawnee. They recognize that the situation is changing. I mean, that they're basically completely surrounded by American settlers. That their traditional way of life, it just wasn't feasible anymore, and so they work to basically align themselves with American interest and try to become like Americans. But there were bands in Missouri that wanted to maintain that traditional way of life. And so you've got those divisions. Then the missionaries come in, and you've got this split between the Methodists and the Baptists and the Quakers, and in addition to these religious divisions, it had a political aspect too, because Johnson and the Methodists, they had the backing of the federal government, basically. The Indian agent at that time was a Methodist and was a slave owner. And so he and Johnson were, they worked, very tightly together. And then when the Shawnee finally all congregated in the Indian Territory in the 1830s, the progressive chiefs, if you will, they more or less sided with the Methodists at the expense of the Baptists and the Quakers. so again, you just have level upon, layer upon layer upon layer of, these different things working together against the Shawnee. And, again, there was a part of the Shawnee who were embraced, this effort to give them education and teach them how to farm and that kind of thing. But there were others who objected well, mostly because of the presence of slaves at the mission. I mean, there were mostly the Missouri Shawnee opposed slavery, and so they wanted nothing to do with the Methodists, and so naturally they kind of migrate towards the Baptists and the Quakers, and they use all sorts of ways to, I guess, to resist the Methodists and then this civilization program in general. I mean, some parents, they just refuse to send their kids to the Methodist school. On a more individual level, the kids themselves, if they didn't like it, they just took off. And, having regular attendance was a persistent problem for the Methodists primarily, but for all the other, for the Baptists and the Quakers as well. So, some families were split over religious differences and over the slavery issue. So it was not the greatest situation, bottom line, for the Shawnee.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, and that kind of leads us to our next question, what was the role of enslavement then in the Johnson household? You've talked about enslaved people. So what work did they do for Johnson? What work did they do for the mission? And then a couple of subpoints here. Could we call the labor of the Shawnee children in the mission enslavement? And how did that relate to conversion? And you've talked about, some of the Shawnees rejected enslavement, and so that was an issue.
Sure. Well, I all my research, I didn't really ever come across all that much related to, the tasks that, the slaves perform at the mission. I'm assuming that, they did some household tasks for Johnson and that kind of thing. And, the men probably, no doubt, worked out on the farm and that kind of thing too. So, I don't really know exactly what type of labor they perform there, but they were definitely there. And, as far as the children, they, you look at some of the annual reports for the mission, and it kind of reads almost like a corporate balance sheet kind of thing. I mean, because they had, the girls, they sewed, X number of clothing for the school, and and then they did this much weaving, that kind of thing, and the boys, they helped cultivate so many acres of land, or they there was a furniture shop there, and they created this how many pieces of furniture, that kind of thing. As I said, you really got to wonder, how much they got out of this whole experience. It's hard to say for sure. So I don't know if you could call it enslavement, but it's pretty close. I mean, I got this. While I was researching this thing, I got this uncomfortable feeling that, this is like a sweatshop kind of situation almost. And so, yeah, it was tough for everybody around, at that point.
Yeah. And so I think you're saying like a system of exploitation, definitely.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And do you happen to know like how many enslaved people officially Johnson had in his household?
Again, that's something that I never came across, exact number. I believe when he in 1832 or 33, whenever he first brought slaves, I think there was like, he had brought 3 of them with him. But by the time that he had left or the school closed, I've heard figures as maybe high as a dozen slaves that, that he took with him back to Missouri. But I couldn't say for sure how many there were. But certainly there were enough there that gained notice by rival missionaries and other, by many of the Shawnees themselves as well. So there was a definite presence there.
Okay, and so this is connected to some of the questions in the chat and some of the stuff you said before. You talked about like there's not hard evidence that he profited off of this exploitation, but how would you say he benefited in general from his role in Shawnee missionization, short and long term?
Well, at the very end, as I mentioned, he had acquired the 1,200 acres of land without paying a cent. So that definitely helped. But even prior to that, the school was it was a big money making operation. I mean, its position along the Santa Fe Trail, I mean, made it prime situation for making selling goods to all the people that were traveling to California or Oregon or down to Santa Fe, that kind of thing. So I mean, so the furniture shops, the blacksmith shop, they even ran a grocery store for a while. I mean, all of those things were there to earn more and more money in addition to all the money that was coming in from the government and from these Indian educational funds. I mean, the missionaries there, they were paid a salary. I think the figure I saw was like $275 a year. But Johnson, I mean, beyond that salary, I mean, he speculated in the land. He bought all sorts of, property lots in what became Kansas City. He had a freighting business, hauling, material back and forth between, government agencies and, out to the Indians, that kind of thing. So all those things, generated a lot of money. And, I haven't come across anything that's okay, we spent this much on, for the upkeep of the school or for, providing clothing and whatnot, and supplies for the children at the school. And so, again, it's a gut feeling more than anything that he's skimming some of that off of the top. And, there were, over the years, there were numerous accusations that the Methodists, they set the school up where they did because of that, that prime location. And, not just Johnson, but other Methodists, who worked at the school or at the mission, they were poor when they got there, but they were, pretty well off by the time they left. So, where there's smoke, there's fire probably. And so, like I said, there's no smoking gun, but there's definitely reason to be a little suspicious.
Gotcha. Okay, let's see. Why do you think the relationships between Johnson and the Shawnee are obscured today?
Well, boy, that's a hard question to answer. Maybe, just over time, maybe people just want to, they just, those bad things just kind of, go to the back burner. And it just and over time, it just kind of fades into the background. And, because the county was named after Johnson, there's some interest in him, but maybe not digging very deeply into, his past to see all that happened and all that he set into motion. And so, I don't want to say that, there was any personal thing here or political thing that was involved in this. I think is, just as I said, just that effective time that kind of, eroded the edges off of Johnson there.
And speaking of that, someone put in our questions that they submitted. Do you know when the county or how the county came to be known as Johnson County, and was it known as that before his death?
No, it certainly it wasn't called that beforehand. Though I couldn't tell you exactly when the county was named for Johnson. But obviously, it was because of the work that he did there for so many years. So yeah, so I'm sorry can't give you an exact answer on that one.
And can you talk a little more about Johnson's leadership in the pro-slavery movement in Kansas government?
Yeah, he was as a slave owner, and then as the superintendent of this very influential and very large scale operation at the school. He was certainly a very prominent person, and his word carried a lot of weight. And he was elected to the first territorial legislature, and he convinced the territorial government to hold, have a session at the Shawnee Mission, which they did for I think several months anyway. And while they're there, they passed these very stringent pro-slavery laws, and again, you just fueled this effort, I guess, or the split between pro and anti-slavery people, and it just kind of degenerated from there. And so, yeah, I mean, Johnson, as I said, he was very influential, and he played a key role in this whole process.
Excellent, thank you. Let me see some more of the chat, the questions we have. Do you think that there are probably unmarked graves of children at the Shawnee Mission School?
Well, boy, which is kind of interesting because of what they found in Canada, and now the efforts to do searches like that in the U.S. here. I wouldn't be surprised if there were, because there were a number of children who did die while they were at the school. I couldn't give you any hard and fast numbers. But again, there were periodic waves of cholera and smallpox, other diseases, and for the most part, the Shawnee, they just fled further to the west, try to avoid being contaminated or infected. But those children that did stay, where they were buried, you would like to think that at that in the cemetery there, but who knows for sure. So I mean, it definitely there could be unmarked graves around there.
Yeah. Do you know how students came to be enrolled in the school, and did they have to pay tuition?
Well, at least in terms of the Shawnee, they that it was kind of a two-way thing. There were Shawnee chiefs and families that egerly enrolled students at the school. But then the Methodists also went out and tried to recruit students to attend the school. And it was not just the Shawnee, but all the tribes in that area that they tried to reach out to and convince families and bands to send their kids to the school. And as far as tuition, the individual kids didn't necessarily have to pay. I mean, because the funds that came from the educational funds for each tribe kind of helped cover tuition costs. Now, there were a number of white kids from Missouri who also attended the school, and they did pay tuition. And so it was, just another way to make money, by Johnson and the Methodists there. And then in addition to the Methodists going out and recruiting students, sometimes some of the chiefs of other tribes, they actually brought in some students. I mean, in the hope that there's one example I can think from the Kansas Indians, where a chief brought in several boys, and when they got to the Methodist mission, they told Johnson that we want these children to become great men, and we think by having them educated here that they will become great men. Whether or not they did is another question, but that was the thought process among some of the chiefs that did have children go to the school.
Awesome. All right. If anyone has any last minute questions, why don't you throw them in the chat? One other thing I would ask you about, let me see if I got any others here. Is there any evidence that the classes were integrated, meaning white and Native children would have been learning together?
And as far as I know, there were, because as I mentioned, there were some white kids that did attend the school. And though they segregated the classes by sex, so girls and the boys were, kept apart from each other. But in terms of Native American versus white kids, I don't think I ever came across anything that said that they kept them apart from each other. So I'm assuming that they did attend the same classes, they even for a few years there that they even had what they call like the Western Academy, which was kind of like a higher level school, and that kind of, I guess, akin to a high school today, I suppose. And that was almost entirely were white kids, because the missionaries, the teachers at the mission, they were providing a very rudimentary education to these kids, and they really weren't up to that level of attending this academy. So that was one instance where it was pretty much just all just white kids.
Okay, so I think this might be a nice one for us to end on. Is do you have other sources you would recommend people access if they want to learn more about Johnson or this era or this time period?
Well, I can put in a shameless plug for my dissertation, but I'm above that kind of thing, so I won't. But you should look it up. There. Well, again, I had a couple of articles in the Kansas History magazine, but there's been some more recent work done on the Shawnee, not necessarily the school or Johnson per se, but the Shawnee in general. Stephen Warren has done some great work there, and so I would definitely recommend that. And then there's, I guess, some more, I would say, older work. Joe Herring, the Enduring Indians of Kansas. Paul Wallace Gates, 50 Million Acres, and Unruh and Minor, about the end of Indian Kansas, that kind of. So there's a number of works there that definitely provide a good overview of what's going on in Kansas at that time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Abing. And I would tell everyone too, as kind of a wrap up for this, we also are kind of viewing this talk as a past is prologue event, because the Johnson County Arts and Heritage Center is going to begin a redlining exhibit in January 2022, and that's going to go for a year. And so we are trying to investigate with Dr. Abing and some of our programming what happened in the past that sort of led to that redlining history. And so if you think about the Shawnees, and Dr. Abing did a great job of talking about the Shawnees coming to Kansas and then being forced to leave Kansas and Johnson's role in that. So this is a wonderful way to sort of think about that. And I would say, promoting my own events, there is going to be another event in November. So you can look at at Kansas Studies Institute on Instagram or at jccc.edu/Kansas Studies. I'm going to do another interview like this with an adopted member of the Wyandotte Nation of Kansas to talk about their similar experience in the similar time and how that also relates to a lot of the themes that Dr. Abing had to share with us. So thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it so much. We want to thank the Center for Sustainability. We want to thank our CoLab Center for helping us. And thank you for all you wonderful participants.
Hey, it was my pleasure. Thank you.